Now that Pemberley is part of Elizabeth's summer holiday itinerary, she's embracing the experience. Mr Darcy won't be at home, so there's zero chance of them having an awkward meeting. It's only been a few months since his disastrous proposal, so seeing him would probably cause Lizzie to die of embarrassment. Wow, what a grand estate this is, and the house is truly magnificent. Elizabeth is gobsmacked. To think she could have been mistress of Pemberley. Yeah, right. Not in a million years after what Mr Darcy said about her family. But she's struck by the wonderful things his housekeeper says about him. It's as if Mr Darcy is a local saint, and that portrait of him is so striking that Lizzie stares at it for a good while, before returning for a second look. Hey team, just a reminder, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel out, and our next upload could be on something taught in your next class. Thanks, and back to the video. As the group make their way outside for a tour of the grounds, the unthinkable happens. Mr Darcy shows up, in the flesh, a day early, and catching everyone off guard. Despite the mutual embarrassment, Mr Darcy is civil towards Elizabeth, gentle even. She can barely look at him as he struggles through some small talk before excusing himself. Oh well, they're here now. Might as well continue the tour. But as the group explore Pemberley's woods, Mr Darcy shows up again. He and Elizabeth end up walking together, while Mr and Mrs Gardiner straggle behind. During their conversation, Mr Darcy asks Elizabeth if he can introduce her to Georgiana, his younger sister. She'll be arriving at Pemberley tomorrow, along with the Bingleys. Knowing how much Mr Darcy adores his sister, Elizabeth takes this as a massive compliment. Mr Darcy also graciously invites the travellers inside for refreshment, but they politely decline. In the carriage ride back to Lambton, the group discuss Mr Darcy's impressive character. But wasn't he meant to be ill-tempered? Hadn't he ruined Mr Wickham's future? Elizabeth must now undo all her previous bad-mouthing. So she explains how she heard a truer version of what happened between Darcy and Wickham while she was in Kent. Elizabeth doesn't give all the details, but it's enough to restore Mr Darcy's reputation and cast doubt on Mr Wickham's. To everyone's astonishment, Mr Darcy brings Georgiana to meet Elizabeth the very next day. Again, Elizabeth is caught off guard, but her aunt and uncle can see what's going on here. Mr Darcy is in love. But no sooner had the introductions taken place than Mr Bingley pops in to say hello. He's still as warm and friendly as ever, and Elizabeth detects that he still thinks of Jane. That's promising. Elizabeth is astonished by the change in Mr Darcy. She thought he was repulsed by her relations. Now he's eager to please them. As the visit comes to an end, Mr Darcy makes a point of inviting them all to dinner at Pemberley. When Elizabeth is alone, she tries to figure out her feelings towards Mr Darcy. Mostly, she's just grateful that he doesn't hate her after the way she rejected him. Elizabeth now respects Mr Darcy more than ever. The question is whether she should encourage a renewal of his feelings towards her. Time will tell. For now, Elizabeth and Mrs Gardiner plan to visit Georgiana the next day, while the men go fishing. Elizabeth knows that visiting Georgiana at Pemberley will be interesting, because Mr Bingley's sisters will be there. Knowing how jealous Miss Caroline Bingley is of Elizabeth's connection to Mr Darcy, tension is inevitable. After they arrive and are seated in the lovely saloon, the other ladies do a good job of keeping the conversation going. The appearance of food is also a relief. Having heard of the lady's arrival, Mr Darcy comes in from fishing to say hello. It's clear that he wants to facilitate a stronger friendship between Elizabeth and Georgiana. This infuriates Miss Bingley, so she takes a shot at Elizabeth's family. But her rudeness backfires and only makes Mr Darcy pay closer attention to Elizabeth. The visit ends soon after this, but Miss Bingley continues saying nasty things about Elizabeth. Mr Darcy finally shuts her up by saying that Elizabeth Bennet is one of the most beautiful women he's ever known. On the third morning of Elizabeth's holiday in Derbyshire, she receives letters from Jane. They bear some shocking news. Lydia has run off with Wickham. There's little hope that they've married, and apart from the suspicion that they're somewhere in London, no one knows where they are. It's believed that Lydia has fallen prey to Wickham, which will disgrace the entire Bennet family. Jane begs Elizabeth and the Gardiners to come home so that Mr Gardiner can help Mr Bennet find Lydia. In a panic, Elizabeth jumps up to run after Mr and Mrs Gardiner, who've gone for a walk. But when the door opens, Mr Darcy is there. He can see that something is very wrong, so Elizabeth tells him what's happened. Darcy listens carefully and paces up and down the room. She can feel his regard for her slipping, which is a predictable result of Lydia's actions. Ironically, Elizabeth now realises that she could have loved Mr Darcy, but that's all useless now, and Elizabeth succumbs to the humiliation. Despite his real compassion for her, Mr Darcy knows he should get going. Before he leaves, Elizabeth sends her apologies about dinner and asks him to keep this nasty business a secret for as long as possible. As he departs, Elizabeth realises that's probably the last time she'll ever see him. When Mr and Mrs Gardiner return to the inn, Elizabeth relays the shocking news, and they're soon on the road back to Longbourn. Knowing how frivolous and naive Lydia is, Elizabeth suspects that she's been totally swept up in a premarital romance. As she returns to Longbourn, Elizabeth also learns that Lydia and Wickham are still missing. Mr Gardiner assures his hysterical sister, Mrs Bennet, that he'll go directly to London to help Mr Bennet recover Lydia. Mrs Bennet insists that if they find the fugitive couple, they must force them to marry. It turns out that in her last letter to Kitty, Lydia has dropped hints about what she was preparing to do. Apparently, she and Wickham had been in love for many weeks during her stay at Brighton. Kitty had said nothing until news came from Brighton about their elopement. Jane and Elizabeth now deeply regret not warning their family about Wickham and his tendency to run off with young ladies. Before she left, Lydia left a note for Mrs Forster, the lady with whom she was staying. In it, Lydia gleefully explains her plan to run away with Wickham and return as his wife. Silly girl. Their father and uncle better track her down soon, or this scandal will be the talk of the town, if it's not already. The Bennet ladies anxiously wait for news. In the meantime, they keep receiving scandalous reports of Wickham's deeds around town. Not only did he get a bad rep for seducing young ladies, but he also racked up some serious debts during his stay in Meryton. What a creep. The ladies eventually receive word from Mr Gardiner. He has arrived in London and united with Mr Bennet in the hunt for Lydia and Wickham. But so far, they have no leads. Every day, the Bennet ladies wait anxiously for the post. Luckily, Jane and Elizabeth intercept an unwelcome letter from Mr Collins, who commiserates with Mr Bennet over the family's disgrace. Thanks to him, Lady Catherine is aware of the scandal and has offered her opinion that the rest of the Bennet girls are now tarred for life. Mr Collins also gloats about not marrying Elizabeth and advises the family to shun Lydia forever. Thanks, Mr. Collins. No one asked you. When they do receive a letter from Mr. Gardner, there's no good news. Still no leads, as Wickham appears to have no family or friends. All he does have is massive gambling debts. Things are looking bad for Lydia. Mr. Bennet then returns home, leaving Mr. Gardner to continue the search. The poor man is in low spirits and blames himself for the way Lydia has turned out. He commends Elizabeth for her wisdom in advising him months ago to prevent Lydia from going to Brighton. Mr. Bennet is overwhelmed with regret and vows to be a more watchful father from now on, which is bad news for Kitty. Will Lydia and Wickham ever be found? Stay tuned to find out. We hope you enjoyed this schooling online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.